and I'm going to try to stay by my computer. If I start drifting away, someone bring me back. Okay. I tend to like to walk as I'm talking, and I like to be demonstrative when I'm talking. So today I need to be here because this computer was freaking out. Okay. Okay. So talk about growth promotants. Now we're going to start talking about kind of like feed and bunk management. Today's lecture is going to be on receiving cattle. So we'll go into protocols that are, that we have around receiving cattle into a feedlot to be either placed on a grower ration or stepped up on feed. Okay. Um, and then I think next we'll talk about reading bunks. Okay. Bunk scoring, making feed calls, the types of decisions that go into that process. Okay. So receiving cattle. I want you guys to know why when we receive cattle, we will typically, and most people will recommend that we give them free choice and ad libitum hay. So this would be like unprocessed long stem hay, could be square bales that they flaked out, or could be round bales that they've kind of moderately processed so that they could fill the bunks. But we are going to give cattle, when they first arrive to a feed yard, free choice hay. Okay. Then why, after we receive cattle, do they lose weight? I think that answer is going to be pretty obvious, especially after some of our previous lectures. Okay. But why do cattle lose weight? And around how long does it take for that animal to recover their pay weight? Okay. That's a very important economic impact, right? If we have cattle that we paid for a specific amount of weight, then they lose weight when they get to arrival. We don't actually start making money on that animal until they recover their initial pay weight. Okay. Okay. So I want you to be able to describe the two methods that are commonly used to transition cattle to a finisher diet. Okay. And then discuss the advantage and disadvantage of these two methods. Then describe the relationship between initial, so placement body weight, and then average dry matter intake over the feeding period. Okay. Heavier cattle are going to eat more. There's a couple of reasons for that. And then know how season can impact dry matter intake. So the season of which cattle are placed on feed can have an impact on dry matter intake. Okay. A lot of this information I'm going to cover today will be from the most recent Feedlot Consulting Nutritionist Survey. Okay, so Samuelson, this is Kendall Samuelson out of West Texas A&M. Okay, her, Dr. Gallion out of Texas Tech, Clint Loest out of New Mexico State, and others sent out a survey to consulting nutritionists, pretty much with mainly operating within the Southern Great Plains. Okay, so Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas. These guys kind of operate everywhere. So, and they basically asked them a series of questions about their suggested management strategies to try to provide insight into what feed yards are doing in terms of managing cattle. Okay, so there's a lot of information there. I would highly recommend, especially if you have interest in this area, to look into that paper. Okay, so admittedly, it is now about a decade old, right? So management changes. Hopefully, this gets redone relatively soon, but it's really our best understanding of management practices within the U.S. feedlot industry. Okay. All right. So when cattle are first received, they are likely physiologically stressed, right? In often cases, they've been on a truck for 12, could be 14 hours. Okay. Transported that long. When they're in the truck, they're not eating. We don't give them feed or hay. They don't have access to water. Okay. So they're likely dehydrated. Okay. Some may be ill at arrival. Okay. They may have contracted BRD from commingling in cell barns. Okay. They're likely malnourished. So many of these guys have been were sold at a local auction market, small one, local cell barn, small cell barn, and then were purchased there, then brought to a more regional one, and then were sold again. So they could have traded hands 3 or 4 times and been in the auction market for a week, right? While they're in these auction markets, they're typically fed a diet that may not be nutritionally balanced, right? So these guys are likely malnourished, could be protein deficient, could be energy deficient. Quite often, they're mineral deficient. Okay, so if you hear people talk about stale cattle, that's what they're referring to. And the big indication of stale cattle or cattle that have been in an auction market for a long time is they have poor coat color, clarity, mud, and that is largely driven by mineral malnutrition. Okay, makes sense? All right. They may be familiar, they're likely familiar with hay or forages. They were probably exposed to hay and grasses while they're with their mom in the cow-calf sector. However, they're largely going to be unfamiliar with feed bunks, okay, and also water troughs. So a large number of these animals will have only drank water out of a pond, okay? So they're being introduced to a new environment. We're expecting them to know how to eat and interact in that environment and how to drink water in that environment. And this whole process from transporting to being commingled to being placed in this new environment can cause a lot of physiological stress. Okay. All right. So a little bit on behavior. So pen conditions have a big impact on how cattle first interface with their new environment. Okay. So who has ever turned cattle that you just bought out onto pasture? Okay. Anybody? Yeah. Okay. What about into like a dry lot, new pen? What's like the first thing they'll start doing? They'll walk the exterior of that location. So if they're doing that in that first initial assessment and they see excessive manure where pens haven't been cleaned and scraped, they see dirty water troughs, right, where the water troughs haven't been cleaned. They see feces and manure in the J bunk. That's not a very good introduction to their new environment, right? Also, if we don't have feed in place in that J bunk when they first are introduced to that pen and they're doing their initial walk around, then they may not learn. It may delay the time that they learn where they're going to get their food out of that J bunk, that concrete bunk. Okay. So we need to have pen conditions ready to receive cattle. Okay. So behavior, like we said, they'll walk a fence line and familiarize themselves with their new environment. And we want this to be a pleasant experience for them, or at least as pleasant as possible, right? So we need clean waters and feed bunks. And then this is also their first experience with us as managers, right? So we want to try to employ low stress animal handling. If we get them in and we're shocking them with a hot shot right off the truck, okay, they're going to be pretty well set up to have a poor opinion of us, right? So we want them to associate us with positive things and not associate us with these negative things. So it's very important, especially during this initial processing, to use these kind of low stress animal handling. So be patient with them. Don't run them to their new pens from the processing barn, these types of things. Make sense? Okay. So water troughs, cattle may have only drinking out of ponds before. They may be unfamiliar with and even if they have drank out of a water trough, they may be unfamiliar with the water trough that you have at your current location. Okay. So let's think about someone who could have drank out of just like a plastic water trough that is open. Okay. Cattle may have drank out of that on farm. Okay. What if they need to learn how to push that ball float down to get access to water? Okay. They may not know how to do that. So if you have a different type of water trough, these animals may not be experienced on how to access that water. Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay. Feed bunks. They may not have ever eaten anything out of a feed bunk. Some producers may supplement cattle in like a plastic bunk or trough. Very rarely will a cow-calf producer actually have a concrete J bunk that's what we'll use at a feed yard. Okay. So even if they have eaten out of a trough before, They're likely unfamiliar with that specific J bunk that these feedlots will have. Okay. So we need feed bunks to be clean, free of manure and other debris. So cattle evolved on pasture, right? They have evolved to have a certain level of fecal avoidance. Okay. If they graze too close to other animals' feces, they are more likely to ingest parasites. Okay. So because of that, they've evolved to have fecal avoidance. So if we have feed in a feed bunk and right underneath that feed there's a big pile of manure, chances are those animals will not eat like they should out of that feed bunk. Okay? So we need these bunks to be clean, free of manure and other debris. Quite often, whenever you're cleaning pens, let's say you have somebody in a skid steer or payloader, they're going to push that bucket up against the feed bunk. Then when they scoop it up, it may throw some manure into the bunk. So you need to make sure that you go back through and clean that out. Okay? Preferably, you'll have long stem hay, so unprocessed hay, and you'll want to provide it to them free access to this hay, so ad libitum. So we'll do that for around 4 to 7 days. Okay. At arrival until after processing, this could be their sole diet. Probably most commonly, people will run cattle through for their initial processing, maybe just a few hours after they arrive to the feedlot. Okay. Some people may put animals in just like a larger dry lot with a round bale and wait 12 to 24 hours before they'll run them through for initial processing. But kind of my perception, most people will kind of work cattle as they arrive to a feed yard. Okay. So, uh, during those first few days, this long stem hay may be the only diet that they receive. Okay. So, following processing, we'll start them on a TMR. So, typically, we'll deliver the TMR, and that will be delivered on top of this hay. Why would we want to do this? I think I'd probably say we don't expect most of our feeder cattle to have experience consuming TMRs, right? Okay. So by distributing that initial feed on top of that long stem hay, as they try to bite that hay, they'll eat some of that TMR and start familiarizing themselves to this new diet. Okay. So after 4 to 7 days, remove hay and feed receiving diet solely. Okay. All right. More on pen conditions. So pen space per animal. So this is from the FASS Ag Guide. Okay. Basically, if we do research with animals, livestock animals, we have to follow this Ag Guidebook. Okay. So it's like as research animal scientists, um, we have to follow the regulations that are outlined in this, or we have to justify for a scientific reason why we're not following this. Okay. All right. So, FASAG guidebook says for unpaved lots with mounds, we'll want 250 to 500 feet squared per animal. Okay. Samuelson and others in 2016, uh, based off their survey data, said that in the summer, most people so on average, most people will recommend a minimum of 156 feet squared per head. The mode, so the most frequently answered was 200, and then the maximum was 254 feet squared. But again, the mode was 250 feet squared. Okay, so feedlots in the summer will allocate around 200 feet squared to 250 feet squared. In the winter, we have a different recommendation. Okay, 150 feet squared to 250 feet squared. Okay. Um, all right. Feed bunk space. We talked about this in our backgrounding lecture about how bunk space could impact, how many cattle can, so this is linear bunk space per head, how many cattle can access the bunk at one time and actually consume at the same time. According to the Ag Guide, when fed once daily, we need to allocate 22 to 26 inches. When fed twice daily, we need to allocate 11 to 13. Okay. Samuelson, they reported that for receiving cattle, uh, the average and the mode were the same at 12 inches. Okay. Whereas the finishing is more dense. Finishing cattle will be around 9 inches. Okay. Why would we want to allocate more bunk space to receiving cattle than for finishing cattle? Yeah, I think it's much more important that you allocate enough space for these animals to have access to that bunk so that they can get on feed as quickly as possible and then start regaining that pay weight. Okay? So good thought. All right. So feeding hay at arrival. Okay. Most people are doing this for some period of time. Okay. So Lofgreen, this is the same Lofgreen at UC Davis who developed the NE system. You guys would have heard of Lofgreen and Garrett. Okay. So Lofgreen and Kirksey, 1982, they conducted a study at New Mexico State. The Clayton Research Center actually just saw that they have two positions, feedlot positions that they're advertising there. So this is in northeast New Mexico, about 3 hours away from Amarillo, which would be the largest city to you. So, um, so they provided cattle, um, either alfalfa for the first week only, native hay for the first week only, native hay for 4 weeks, or native hay and then a protein supplement. Okay. They looked at treatment percent, days treated, daily feed intake, daily gain, and then feed to gain over that receiving period. Okay. So by providing 4 weeks of hay, it reduced the percent of calves that were treated by 38%. Okay. So providing hay to cattle initially being received as opposed to not providing hay uh, uh, will reduce BRD morbidity. Okay. So according to Samuelson's survey, most are fed hay at receiving, so about 64% of respondents, for at most 14 days. So that was the maximum. Average was 4 days, 3 days was the mode. So most people, most respondents were feeding hay or recommending their clients to feed hay for 3 days following arrival. Okay. Me personally, I will recommend doing 4 to 7 days. I would say provide free choice ad libitum long stem, so unprocessed, unground hay to cattle that for low risk cattle for 4 days, then for high risk cattle for 7 days. Okay. So this achieves most of the improvement we see in sickness rates uh, with feeding hay for 28 days while permitting good gain during that receiving period. Okay. So if we only provided hay for that first 28 days, we're going to have kind of poor rates of gain during that receiving period. So 4 to 7 days, 4 days for low risk, 7 days for high risk. It's kind of my opinion. And based on what I've seen in the literature, this will get you most of that benefit of feeding it for 28 days, but you can still get them up on a starter, step them up on feed quicker, and you'll have faster rates of gain over that feeding period. Okay. So here is a rule of thumb. During the first 7 days, calves will eat about 1 to 1.5% of their body weight as hay, and half to 1% of their body weight as a mixed ration. Okay. All right. Initial processing. See if I can move this. Okay. Most cattle are received and allowed to rest for 12 to 24 hours. So that was 67% of respondents. Okay. They will sort them according to weight within lot. Okay. So a lot could be a truckload, could be this, your, if you're a custom feeding yard, it could be a client purchased 3 truckloads and then brought them in. They're received at the same time. So they will not sort across lots. They will keep lots separate. Okay. That's so that they don't have a problem later on when they're marketing these animals in allocating which animal belongs to who, right? If you start mixing in lots and you're a custom feeder, you can start having problems with like keeping track of who owned which animal. Okay. So they're going to sort based off weight within lot. So 44% sorted into outcome groups, so a little under half. So about, what is that, 56% are not sorting based off outcome groups, okay, which means based off initial body weight. Of these, 30% are sorted at arrival, okay. 30% did a terminal sort at reimplant. So they may bring in all the animals, may not sort them initially, but at reimplanting, they'll then do a terminal sort at reimplanting. 56% sorted based on body weight only. Okay, 12% were using ultrasound. It's probably high, I think. And then 17% use some sort of automated sorting biometrics. The most common one was developed by Max Garrison. He's pretty involved here. He did his vet degree here at A&M. I think his bachelor's, maybe. But he actually sold this product to Elanco. I don't exactly remember what it's called, but it was a chute side. And as you measured like length of the animal, hip width, heart girth, it was basically the string that as you wrapped it around the animal or moved it, it would take that measurement. Okay, so I'm guessing that's what most of the people that are sorting based off of biometrics would be doing, but I'm not sure. Okay, he's actually created this new product that Kyle was worked on for his thesis, and it's basic. They call it millimeter radar, and so it's like this, and it has one radar over the back. And as an animal runs through it, it takes 60 slices, so 60 measurements of the dimensions of that animal, and kind of gives you estimates of like, I don't know, there's probably 120 different estimates, but heart girth, hip height, you can estimate frame score, and these types of things to allow you to sort based off of the physical dimensions of that animal as opposed to merely just weight. So that's kind of interesting. Okay. So parasiticide examples. Okay, most people are going to give some kind of injectable pour on or oral drench to target gastrointestinal parasites. Okay, so 30% are giving an injectable and an oral drench. My best guess is that most people are using Dectomax as their injectable, and then Safeguard as their oral. Okay, and then this Cydectin is an example of the pour on. Okay, and then 30% are giving just an injectable. Okay. Yes.
There, so parasite that you would recommend, or is like
That me personally, what I've heard is that these white oral dewormers like Safeguard and there's other products like it, they don't work.
at least not
Oh, what I've heard is they work well for the parasites that cattle will get on like summer grass. Um, better than the injectable. Okay, that's just what I've heard. Um, most people are using, and I should have freshed up on this, but uh, it's like lactone something. I don't remember the class of the drug, but resistance to these anthometics is becoming a real big deal. There hasn't been a new one created in like 50 years, and everyone's using the same one. So these parasites are becoming resistant to them. So that's becoming a big deal. Um, but we always did Dectomax, and then on cattle coming off summer pasture, we'd do Dectomax and Safeguard. And then just depending on if they have lice or something, whether we would give them a pour on or seasonally, if like flies are real bad. Like we wouldn't really do it if they were going to be on feed for the bulk of a winter time because flies wouldn't be so bad, but we would if they're going to be placed in the spring. Yes. No, 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 no. Really just focus on the study guide and the learning objectives. But yeah, that's just for your information. Okay. Okay. Implants. So we talked about this last Tuesday, a week ago. So the vast majority of cattle will receive an implant at arrival. They may receive the extended release. They may receive an initial and terminal implant, but most of them are going to get an implant at arrival. Okay. Ones that aren't doing it are trying to go after some kind of natural program to where they can get added value premiums for having natural cattle raised without growth promotants. Okay. However, as I hope you guys saw, the huge increase you see in growth performance by using implants, by using beta agonists, using ionophores, and these technologies are stackable and cumulative, right? Um, that premium that you'd receive from marketing cattle as natural will never offset the opportunity cost of using these growth promotants. Okay. Metaphylaxis. So, what is metaphylaxis? Mass treatment of cattle on arrival. Okay. Survey indicated that 28% of the cattle that were received by the feedlots covered by these consulting nutritionists received cattle that were high risk. Of those, 83% of respondents would say that they would uh, employ metaphylaxis for high risk exposed cattle. 39% would use them for high risk, which, if you remember back to our previous lecture, I don't even remember which one it was, but we have high risk exposed. These are the most risky. High risk, these are medium risky. Then low risk, these have little risk. Okay, so about 40% would use them for high risk cattle, 6% would use them for low risk. So you still have 6% of respondents who are going to metaphylaxisly treat even low risk cattle, which is seems a waste, but I don't know. Okay. All right. So receiving or the starting diet, okay. You may hear it called a receiver, receiving, or starter diet. So roughage content of the receiving diet has an impact, obviously, on dry matter intake, has an impact, obviously, on average daily gain, will have an impact, obviously, on feed to gain. So as roughage increases, uh, average daily gain is going to decrease. As roughage increases, dry matter intake is going to decrease. They have less potential to eat that typically low quality forage that we're going to use in these in finish in feedlots. Okay. However, as you increase roughage, you're actually going to reduce morbidity. Okay. So if you're going to feed 100% to high risk cattle and have a morbidity rate of 42% versus 30% roughage, which have a morbidity rate of somewhere around 47%, why aren't we just feeding everybody 100% roughage for the duration of their receiving period? Did anybody follow the question I asked? No? Okay. So, based off of this meta-analysis these guys did, if they fed 100% roughage, so no concentrate diet to cattle at receiving, you could take these high-risk cattle and make them have a morbidity rate, so number of first treatments, right, of 42%. Okay? That's just a rough guess, kind of eyeballing it here. Compared to something that's around 30% roughage, okay, so 70% concentrate, we would have a morbidity rate of around 47%. Okay. So by increasing the roughage content of our receiving diet, we're going to reduce morbidity, so reduce incidence of BRD. So that sounds like a great thing. Why aren't we feeding only 100% roughage diets to receiving cattle? Exactly. Any incremental benefit you have from reducing morbidity by feeding them, and subsequently you should reduce mortality, right? Um, will be offset by lower rates of gain during even a 28-day receiving period. Okay. Okay. And that's what they've looked at here. So they, using their models, they just kind of summarized if you had a 40% of dry matter of dietary roughage receiving diet versus 100%. Okay. So average daily gain for your 40%, they're gaining 0.6 kilograms per day. Okay. Compared to the 100% roughage, they're gaining 0.06, so much less, right? Because these high roughage diets are going to have much lower energy, right? So their rates of gain are going to be less. Okay. Dry matter intake for this 40% roughage diet's 4.8 compared to this 100% roughage diet, which is 4. Okay. Morbidity. So you did reduce morbidity by about 4 percentage units. Okay. 40 versus 36. Mortality. You saved 0.25% of death loss on these cattle. Okay. Your feed cost is much higher. Typically, roughages are a relatively high cost ingredient. Okay. And because of that higher feed cost and that cost of gain, which is driven by feed cost plus a low rate of gain, right? Your net profit per calf for that feeding period, you're losing a whole lot of money if you fed 100% roughage compared to relatively less loss of money if you're feeding a lower roughage diet. Now, these numbers are based off of 2005, right? So they're outdated, but it just paints the picture that any benefit you have from feeding a 100% roughage diet in terms of morbidity and mortality will not offset the opportunity cost of poorer performance. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. So there's no real standard receiving diet. Everyone is doing something different. Okay. So average rough and inclusion averaged around 40% of dry matter, according to Samuelson's feedlot survey. So the average feed yard or average respondent said that they're feeding 40% of dry matter as roughage. Okay. 37.5% of respondents said that they're using 30 to 40%. Okay. 37.5 to 41% used greater than 40%. 8.3% used 20 to 30%. 12.5% used 10 to 20%. So the range of what people are doing in terms of roughage inclusion in their starters is wide, right? There's a lot of people doing different things. Okay. Byproduct inclusion. So these would be like distiller's grain, sweet bran, corn gluten, etc. 37.5% of respondents fed 10 to 20% of the diet dry matter as a byproduct. Most of these were wet distiller's grains or corn gluten feed. Most of those corn gluten feeds, I'm assuming, would be sweet bran. Um, Not very many people are feeding just non-sweet bran corn gluten feed. Okay. Grain inclusion, 47.8% of respondents said that they were going to have 30 to 50% of their receiving diet be their grain source. Most of those are corn. Depending on where they're at, most of that corn would be steam flaked. Okay. Any questions? Okay. So this is a receiving diet we used when I was at Bushland. So 41% steam flake corn, corn stalks, so 16%. For our finisher diet, we would predominantly feed only corn stalks. Okay. We don't really care if it's a high quality forage. We just have it in there on a finishing diet to stimulate chewing so they can have some ruminal buffering from saliva production. Okay. But for receiving diets, we would buy in this wheat hay to try to increase the quality of the hay that we're feeding. But total roughage in this diet was 35%, so this plus this. Distiller's grains, we included about 10.8%. Then we added 6% molasses. Why might we do that? Palatability, try to stimulate them to get on feed as quick as possible by giving them a little sweet treat. All right. Okay. We had a 5% supplement premix, so that'd be our vitamin minerals, rumensin. We added 1.5% corn oil and then 0.7% urea. Okay. We also fed them free choice Bermuda grass hay for a week. Okay. So this is the nutrient specs. So it's 65% dry matter, 14% crude protein, 30% NDF, and then 54 megacals of NEG per hundredweight. Okay. All right. So how do cattle respond to transportation stress upon arrival? Okay. So Hutchison, does anybody know John Hutchison works for Merck? He's just moved to, I think he moved to College Station maybe the last 5 years or so. He lives in College Station. He's head of beef sales for Merck, Merck Animal Health. And his dad Old Hutch is this guy. Okay, he worked at Bushland for Texas A&M, and he collaborated a lot with this guy. So that's Andy Cole. Andy had my position at Bushland prior to me starting there with the USDA. So they did a lot of work together on what was called shipping fever at that time. Okay, so shipping fever would be cattle being transported, experience physiological stress, losing a lot of weight, succumbing to BRD, and then you have high rates of morbidity, right? So that was classically called shipping fever. Okay. So here they had healthy cattle versus morbid cattle. So those cattle that were classified as illness sometime during the receiving period. Okay. All cattle within that first 7 days lost weight. Okay. Healthy cattle lost about half as much weight as morbid cattle. I mean, these guys lost 6 pounds a day for a week. That's crazy. Okay. Compared to these healthy animals that lost 2 pounds a day for a week. So healthy cattle would have lost 14 pounds. Morbid cattle would have lost 35 pounds. Okay. Then during days 1 through 28, healthy cattle started gaining weight. So in essence, the gain from day 8 to 28 offsets that initial body weight loss from days 1 through 7. Okay. Whereas these sick cattle still did not gain weight. Okay. Days 1 through 56, the healthy cattle gained around 2 pounds a day. So they gained so much weight from days 8 to 56 that it offset the start week where they lost 2 pounds a day, so that they were gaining 2 pounds a day. Does that make sense? Okay. Compared to sick cattle who still never gained weight during their starting period. If anything, they had just recouped their initial body weight loss. Okay. Dry matter intake during this time. So healthy animals ate a lot more at arrival, especially during that first 7 days. Okay. So 1.55 pounds of dry matter, or 1.55% of body weight. So this is 1.55% of body weight, compared to less than a percent for the sick cattle. Now, is this the chicken or the egg, right? What came first for these sick cattle? Did they arrive at the feedlot already sick, and so they felt bad, and so they didn't eat? Or did they arrive to the feedlot and didn't eat, became more stressed, became more susceptible to BRD? What do you guys think? I suspect it's probably both. Um, yeah, I imagine quite a number of them arrived to the feedlot sick, but I imagine that some of them took longer to get acclimated to the feed bunk because they were starving and dehydrated. They became more susceptible to BRD, and so it increased their incidence of morbidity. Okay. But then you see dry matter intake begin to increase throughout the next, for the 56-day receiving period. Any questions on this? Okay. So cattle will pretty much always lose weight after they get received. Okay. A lot of that is lost during transportation when they're held for up to 12 hours or longer, depending on where they're shipping from, being shipped to. So the extent that they will lose weight kind of depends on those things, right? However, they will all really pretty much lose weight. Okay. So it becomes important, how long does it take that animal to recoup their pay weight? Okay. Because you can't start making money, you can't start adding value to that animal until they at least weigh what you paid for, right? Does that make sense? Okay. So this paper by Smithyman, I should have updated this, but it was actually accepted this year. So this was McKenzie at New Mexico State, did this study with Vinny, who now is AgriLife there in Bushland. He was my counterpart there. So we worked on this. We had high risk exposed heifers. Okay. So of these animals, they had 43% morbidity rate. So 43% were treated for BRD once. Okay. 14% received a second treatment. 3% received a third treatment. And these cattle also had 6.7% death loss. So very high risk heifers, the poor girls. Okay. These heifers lost 100 pounds, so that's 16% of their pay weight. That's crazy. Okay. Um, so this was their pay weight, right around 625. After arrival, day one, they weighed 525. Okay. So they lost 16% of their body weight during that transportation. Okay. So this body loss comes from dehydration, right? So they're losing water because they're not drinking on the truck, but also from shrinkage, so gut fill loss because they're not eating on the truck. Okay. So these cattle came from the southeast and they averaged 11 hours on the truck. Okay. So during that 11-hour period, they lost 100 pounds. Crazy. Okay.
The pay weight, they would have already had a strength. The pay weight would have already been shrunk too, right? So
Yeah, typically they'll apply a 4% pencil shrink. So, and actually in NASA models, when we go from live weight to shrunk weight, we multiply it by 0.96. So that's a vestige of that old classic 4% pencil shrink. And actually, I think it can range, but that's something you can negotiate is what pencil shrink you'll apply.
these would have had, I guess, in that case, so we'd have.
For sure, by approximately 12% of body weight. All right. Okay. So let me see the order we want to look at here. All right, so the treatments we imposed were a control. So we just gave them the water troughs that they had in their pens. How am I doing on time? What do we leave? 11:20. So I've got 27 minutes. Okay. All right, this control, they just had the water trough that was standard for the feedlot. This supplemental water source, we added another additional water trough to just increase the linear space of the water trough. And then this treatment here, we had supplemental water plus a electrolyte mix within that supplemental water source. Okay. So you can see these cattle that the control cattle drink much less water during days 1 through 4 compared to these other treatments. Okay. Adding a supplemental water source increased water intake during those first 4 days. Okay. But these two treatments were not different, even though they're kind of numerically different. So the idea here is make that water more accessible to them. They're getting off the getting off the truck. They're dehydrated. We need to probably try to make it as accessible as possible for them. So, and we saw that it did actually increase water. However, there was no difference between these for the rest of the these treatments during the rest of the 56-day receiving period. Okay. All right. So this is average daily gain during days 1 through 4. So no difference in treatments and really no difference in average daily gain throughout the finishing period. But you can see that during those first 4 days, rates of gain are very low. Okay. A lot of that's driven by most of what they're going to eat is that free choice hay. Okay. But also low intakes, partly because it's free choice, low quality hay, also partly because they're stressed and they're not going to eat anyways, right? Okay. Um, then dry matter intake, you can see they ate the least during those first 4 days, and then as they were throughout the receiving period, they started eating more. Okay. Any questions on this? I have this here because it's a pretty typical response of dry matter intake, water intake, and feed intake that you see in receiving cattle. Everybody followed? Okay. All right. So Hicks in 1990, so they compiled data from 1993 to 1990 or 1983 to 1985. So that's 3-year period from Hitch Feed Yard in the Panhandle, Oklahoma. So their total data set included 22,000 pens with 145 steers per pen on average. So just under 300,000 cattle. Okay. They determined that cattle lost purchase weight, and on average, they lost about 25 pounds. So this example is extreme, but you can expect that even on short shipped cattle that are only on the truck for like less than 8 hours, they'll still lose weight. Okay. All right. So we have these cattle, they're stressed, we're receiving them, we gave them long stem hay. Now let's start stepping them up onto the receiving diet and then ultimately uh, the finishing diet. So this example is a protocol that my buddy Jarrett uses with his clients. Okay. If they're receiving cattle for a backgrounding growing phase. Okay. So phase one, we start their dry matter intake at about 1.5% of body weight. So you know what they're supposed or close to their initial body weight is. Now, we're not going to run them through a scale again after they go through their initial processing, but based off that initial processing, we can have an idea of how much feed to initially offer. Okay. So we want to start them on dry matter intake at 1.5% of body weight. So for a 500-pound steer, that amounts to 7.5 pounds of dry matter. So we would allocate 7.5 pounds of dry matter per head. Okay. We'll feed this hay ad libitum for 3 to 7 days. So he suggests 3 days for low risk cattle, 7 days for high risk cattle. Okay. So once they kind of get started, then we'll move to phase two and we'll increase dry matter intake by 1 pound per day. So this will be once we pull off that ad libitum hay. We'll increase dry matter intake by 1 pound per day on a slick bunk, which we'll talk about on Thursday. So that means that there's no feed left in the bunk in the morning prior to feeding. Okay. So we'll increase 1 pound daily on a slick bunk until we reach 2% of body weight. Okay. So for a 500-pound steers, that's 10 pounds of dry matter intake. So we'll increase them really aggressively, 1 pound per head per day, with a slick bunk, taking them from 7.5 pounds to 10 pounds of dry matter intake. Okay. Once they get to 2% of body weight, we'll go to step three. We'll increase dry matter intake by 0.75 pounds per day. So a little less of an aggressive feed bump. Okay. We'll do that on a slick bunk until they reach 2.5% of body weight of dry matter intake as body weight. Okay. Then we'll move to phase four, increase them to a 0.5 pound of dry matter by 0.5 pound every day, or excuse me, every third day on a slick bunk to 2.75% of body weight. So what does that mean? That means that we read bunks. So we start this at 2.5% of body weight. We'll read bunks, but we'll make them have a slick bunk for 3 days in a row before we'll offer them that 0.5 pound increase in feed allotment. Okay. All right. Then once they get to 2.75% of body weight, we'll increase dry matter intake by 0.2 every third day on a slick bunk, and we'll try to maintain them somewhere around 2.6 to 2.7% of body weight. Okay. So it will classically take about 2 weeks to get cattle to where they're eating 2.7% of body weight. So there's going to be that initial period, 2 week period, where intake will be increased really sharply. Okay. And then we're going to slow down on how much we're going to bump them, and we're going to make them show us a slick bunk for more days in a row so that that plateau, so that that feed intake curve will start plateauing. Does that make sense? So, and then dry matter intake as a percent of body weight, it will kind of start decreasing as cattle get larger. So they'll start showing you non-slick bunks, right? And so you won't increase intake. But so if you measure that dry matter intake that they actually have as a percent of body weight, it'll start to kind of decrease. You see that with finishing cattle too. Okay. So if we had cattle backgrounded for 126 days, okay, following that protocol, and we never had a slick bump, so every opportunity we increased feed based off that protocol, this is what that feed intake curve would look like. So we'll have this initial 2 week period where we see a rapid increase in feed intake, and then it'll kind of start to plateau a little. Okay. All right. So now this is a protocol that we would have. It's going to be a little different that Jarrett uses with his clients to receive cattle for finishing. Okay. So this is going to look the same. Phase one is when they first arrive to the feed yard. Okay. We're going to start them out at 1.5% of body weight. So for a 500-pound steer, that's going to be 7.5 pounds of dry matter intake. Again, we'll feed that hay ad libitum for 3 to 7 days, 3 for low risk, 7 for high risk. Okay. Again, just like the previous protocol, we're going to step them up on feed. So they'll be fed their starter diet Um, so we'll increase dry matter intake by 1 pound per head on a slick bunk every day on a slick bunk until they reach 2% of body weight. So get up to 10 pounds per day. Then we'll move to phase 3, increase dry matter intake 3/4 of a pound a day every other day on a slick bunk until they reach 2.5% of body weight. Okay, now we get to phase 4, very similar. Increase dry matter intake a 1/2 pound every third day on a slick bunk to 2.75% of body weight. Okay, phase 5, increase dry matter intake by quarter to a 1/2 pound every third day on a slick bunk, and we're trying to maintain a dry matter intake of around 2.75 to 3% of body weight. Okay, so we could feed this step 5, take this step 5 approach for a number of days if we wanted to just grow them from 500 to 900 pounds. So if we wanted to background these animals, okay? But once we get them to the body weight where we want them to start their finisher, okay, we can start doing the transition, okay? Okay, so we'll talk about these step-up protocols, and there's really 2 ways you can transition cattle from a high roughage diet to a high finisher diet. So we'll talk about those and the advantages and disadvantages of these, okay? But as step-ups occur, so this would be multiple ration blend approach. We would do step 1, step 2, step 3, and 4. We want to remain conservative on feed calls, okay? So as we're stepping them up to a new diet that has more concentrate and lower roughage, not only would we be bumping up absolute amount of feed that we're giving them, but we're also going to be having these bumps of energy content of the diet so that we're bumping absolute amount of feed, but also giving an energy bump. Okay, and we'll walk through some examples of that. So you want to be conservative during this time. So you want to increase dry matter intake, so dry matter allocation, and this needs to be based on, we'll talk more about this on Thursday, it needs to be based on really the discretion of the bunk reader and the feed caller, okay? So they're going to look at aggression of cattle to a feed truck. So how aggressively are they getting up to go eat whenever they're coming to a feed truck? They're going to be looking at manure consistency. So we'll talk about that Thursday as well, fecal scoring, okay? And then they're going to look at when did that bunk get slick? So did it get slick right before feeding or did it get slick the night before, right? So they'll typically do 2 bunk readings. Larger feed yards may do a lot of bunk readings throughout the day, but timing of slick is very important for these guys when they're making their decision on feed calls. Okay. All right. So step 6 is the transition protocol. Step 7. So we want the goal for step 7, this would be they're adapted to a finishing diet, and we want them to remain on that finisher until they get harvested. Okay. So the goal for step 7 is to optimize dry matter intake without being so aggressive that we cause crashes, okay, where they eat too much, they feel sick, they don't eat as much the next day, and so their intake crash. So that's what we're trying to avoid. Optimize intake without causing them to come off feed from being too aggressive. Okay, so dry matter intake will decrease. So dry matter intake as a percent of body weight will decrease as cattle get heavier. Okay, we're seeing this in the study I have at McGregor now. We started them on full finisher when they reached 2.8% of body weight of dry matter intake. When they first were transitioned to the finisher, they're eating about 3% of their body weight as full finisher. Now, even though they're like 1,500 pounds now, they're eating 2.5%. Okay, so dry matter intake in pounds is still increasing slightly, but dry matter intake as a percent of body weight starts to decrease. Okay, so the goal is we want our highest dry matter intake to be the last day that cattle are on feed. How often do you think that actually happens? Never. Okay. So this would be our goal. Again, this is just the scenario from receiving to adaptation to maintaining during that step 7, that phase 7. So if we never had any slicks for a cattle group on feed, this is what their dry matter intake curve would look like. So, excuse me, if we only had slick bunks the whole time these animals were on feed, this is what their dry matter intake curve would look like. So this would be the ideal intake curve where that last day they're on feed, they ate the most. Okay. This is what dry matter intake curves commonly look like. Okay. So you have periods of time. Maybe we're too aggressive here, too aggressive here, here, where we gave them too much of a bump in feed or feed call so that they gorged, made themselves feel sick, and then they came off feed the next day. Okay. So these types of drops in intake are what we're trying to avoid. So if you just hypothetically overlaid the ideal curve here and you got rid of these valleys, these peaks and valleys, you would substantially increase the amount of intake that animal consumed. Apply the same feed conversion, you just added 100 days, 100 pounds, rough guess. Okay. But because they have these spouts of time where they're coming off feed, this is unrealized conversion. Okay. So they would be underperforming what their potential is because we were aggressive during our feed calls. We'll talk more about this on Thursday. Okay. So transitioning to a finisher. All right. The rumen needs adequate time to transition from a high roughage diet to a high concentrate diet. Okay. This is because this significant change in diet. I think I got 13 minutes. Okay. All right. You got to give that ruminal microbial population time to transition from a predominantly fibrolytic bacteria to amylolytic. So those bacteria that do well at lower ruminal pHs, do well consuming starch, right? So we need to give time for the microbiome to switch, okay? But we also have to give time for the cattle to learn their new intake regulation. They're going where intake's going to be regulated based off gut fill to being regulated chemostatically through some marker in the blood, could be propionate, glucose, who knows what, could be hepatic oxidation in the liver. I don't know. No one really knows. But we know that there's this switch from a high roughage diet where they're going to be mechanically stimulated. So just gut fill is going to make them stop eating to this chemostatic. So if we just did a rapid switch from a high roughage diet to a high concentrate diet, and they didn't have time to learn this new intake regulation, we'd be setting them up for failure. We'd have a lot more gorging, a lot more ruminal problems. Okay. So there's really two reasons we need to transition to a finisher diet. Allow microbes to transition and allow the host animal to transition. I'd remember that. Okay. Okay. All right. So two main ways that we can transition cattle or step them up onto a finisher. So there's what's called multiple step-up diets. So here we would change ratios of starter diet to finisher diet. However, the key distinction here is that these are mixed and delivered together. Okay. So an example, day 0, they're fed 100% starter and a 0% finisher. Day 1, 75% starter, 25% finisher. Day 7, 50-50. Day 14, 25-75. By day 21, under this protocol, we'd be feeding them 100% finisher. Okay. So, but that finisher and starter, even though we're increasing or changing the ratios of the two, they're mixed and delivered in the same wagon. They're delivered at the same time. Okay. So that's multiple step-up rations. This approach is commonly used by the smaller feedlots, okay, who have a mixer wagon or just one mixer on a truck, right? They're not going to be doing a batch mixing system, which we'll talk more about that later. Okay. Okay. The other approach we can have is a two-ration blending system. Okay. Can be confusing because we're calling it two-ration blending, but here we're mixing the starter and the finisher. These two diets will be mixed and delivered separately. Okay. So larger commercial feed yards will have what's called batch mixing systems. Okay. They'll have one dedicated to a starter diet, one dedicated to their finisher diet, and that's all these mixers do. Then they'll have feed trucks come, get loaded with either a starter or a finisher, okay? And then they'll drive that truck to go get delivered to cattle, okay? So it's a stationary batch mixing system is what allows the large commercial feed yards to do the two ration blending approach. Okay, compared to the small feed yards where they only have one or two trucks, right? They can only mix. They don't have a stationary mixing system, so they are going to mix the starter and ration together and deliver it at the same time. Okay, so it makes you more efficient if you have a batch system to feed those diets separately. Does that make sense? Okay. So, benefits of a multiple step-up rations. You do not need a batch mixing system. There's a level of safety by delivering the starter and finisher mixed together. You have less likelihood of these cattle gorging on a full finisher, right, if they're blended together. Okay. You're less likely cattle will gorge on the finisher diet without adequate adaptation, okay, by mixing them together. So there's a little extra layer of safety there. Okay, so benefits of a two ration blending: decreases mixing time by a lot. It takes a lot of time to go to the commodity barn with your payloader and then load your mixing wagon with these ingredients. Okay, by having a stationary batch mixing system, you can have one person dedicated to just loading the batch mixer and making the feed, and the other person's dedicated to getting filled with the feed and delivering it to the pen. Okay, so there's not as much downtime for the driver of the feed truck if they don't have to wait for their ingredients to be loaded into their truck. They can just load up and then drive. Okay, so it saves a lot of time. However, there's a big expense to these, so that's why they're kind of just reserved for large commercial feed yards, and you won't really ever see them on like a small farmer feeder type feed yard. Okay. All right, according to Samuelson's survey, 56.3% of respondents used multiple step-up diets. On average, they had 4 transition diets, but the most was 3, okay? And on average, they fed each of these diets for 6 days, and mode was 6 as well, okay? So this would be a 24-day transition period, okay? If you took 4 different diets times 6 days, that'd be adapting them over 24 days, okay? 40% of respondents used a 2-ration blending system. On average, they would transition these animals over 27 days, okay? Even though the mode, so that's the average, but the mode of respondents was 20, okay? All right. So we talked about you need to be conservative when you're making your feed calls because not only are you bumping feed intake, but also by switching diets, you're causing an energy bump, okay? So this just looks at this example, okay? Here we have a starter that has 52 megacals of NEG, okay? Our finisher is 65 megacals of NEG. So there will be an energy bump throughout transition, okay? So on day 0, they're fed just the starter. So day 1, we start this transition. They're fed 75% starter, 25% finisher. That NEG of the diet they're being fed went from 52 to 55.25. So that's a 3.25 megacal of NEG per hundredweight increase in energy, okay? And that bump happens every week, okay? So remember these energy bumps for this multiple step-up ration approach compared to the 2-ration blending approach. Okay, so this would be an example of the 2-ration blending approach, right? The starter is 80 and 52 again. Finisher is 95 and 65. Okay, and day 0, 100% starter. They're eating a diet that's 52 megacals per hundredweight of NEG. So day 1, we now are 95% starter, 5% finisher. So in this protocol, we're increasing the amount of finisher that we're feeding by 5% every day, okay? Which you can get away with if you're feeding these 2 diets separately. But logistically, you can't really do that if you don't have a batch mixing system because that's just a whole lot of rations you have to program into your programmer, okay? So in this instance, we're only increasing NEG during these bumps by 0.65 megacals of NEG per day, okay? So much lower energy bump, but happening more frequently compared to the multiple step-up blend system, multiple step-up diet blending system, which has less frequent changes in energy concentration of their diet, but larger bumps. Does that make sense? Okay. So, need to be conservative on your feed calls during this time because you're increasing absolute dry matter allocation, but you're also increasing energy content of that diet. So you have a feed bump and an energy bump, and that can kind of lead to potential issues. Okay. All right. How am I doing? 4 minutes. We may not finish. So this would be an example of a feed yard, okay, that's using a two ration blending uh, approach. Okay. So this feed yard's got 3 feeding times. So they first feeding, second feeding, third feeding. Okay. This just shows the starter to finisher ratio that they would employ. Okay. This tells you the different phases. This tells you the number of days that they're being fed each specific ratio of these diets. Okay. So get them on feed. We're going to feed them 100% starter for 7 days. Okay. 45% of their daily allocation will be allocated during that first drop. Okay. 30% in the second, 25% of their daily allocation of feed in this third drop. Okay. So this represents when we're going to start transitioning to the finisher. So we're going to start with an 85-15 starter to finisher ratio. 45% of their daily feed call will solely come from the starter. That's going to be in that first drop. Okay. Then they're going to receive 15% of their daily feed call as finisher. Okay. And that's going to be 15%. That's going to happen in the second drop. And then this third drop is going to be starter again. And it's going to be 40% of their daily allocation. Okay. So you can see how uh, we're always going to feed starter first until we reach a point where we're feeding more starter than we are, or more finisher than we are starter. Okay. Then that first drop, that first delivery of feed is going to be a finisher diet. Second will be the starter. And then third will again be that finisher. Okay. So you do that until through finish, they're fed 100% of the finisher ration. 40% of their daily feed call will be delivered in the first drop. 35 in the second, 25 in the third. Does that make sense? Okay. So you can see how these protocols can become much more complicated, right? Where you start throwing in timing and which drop you're going to feed which ration. This is all done, this is made, these decisions are made by the feed caller, bunk manager, and they're all programmed in their computer. Okay. Okay. Let's end here.